I think in many ways that was one of the most successful Ghost Labs that we've done that you were able to witness, Steve. I think it felt that very quickly the participants were able to really dig into some quite difficult areas. We had some quite emotional moments of people that I'm pretty sure never really show emotion in public, kind of breaking down and talking about some things that were quite difficult. And I think very quickly able to get into some of the intricacies of the past, but also then kind of begin to think about what that means for the present day and actually maybe how we might move forward from that as well.
I think it was very interesting how people could draw on those things in the past which are still floating around them and are actually quite close to the surface in a way. I think what the Ghost Lab did was to create an environment where it was quite safe to show authentic feelings rather than just answer questions in a surface way. And they related things quite quickly to very recent events that had affected other working class communities. They saw a real connection between their experiences as working class communities and the damage done to them by the government of the day. And what's happened recently in Grenfell, for instance, a real compassionate recognition there, don't you think?
I think absolutely so. I think that's one of the really interesting things that came out of this, that oftentimes in Ghost Labs we might begin by looking at the past as a kind of way in, but actually, as Sue was saying, what came out very quickly today was a sense in which actually these narratives have a real potency today. These things haven't gone away. The violence enacted on the working class might not be through a miners' strike, but it's through gentrification or it's through a kind of imposed austerity. These kind of narratives shift and bend, but in a way they're cyclical. In a way they keep coming back around. And it was interesting how the past, was still present, I thought, in a lot of this stuff. And actually, in a very personal way, Brenda, who was kind of part of the first Ghost Lab, and is sadly now no longer with us. It felt to me today, we kept referencing her, we kept talking about her, we kept saying she would have said this, she would have done that she was actually a very kind of physical presence in the room as a kind of, not a haunting, because that often sounds like a negative word, but as a reminder of something that was no longer with us. I thought that was a really interesting thing.
I absolutely agree with you, because when you asked that initial question, why you're here today, and Rose said, because of Brenda, that really brought Brenda very much into the kind of the present moment, didn't it? Yeah. And also the phrase that Rose wrote on the second card, which is "We are not defeated." Yeah. And I think you talked about it being cyclic, and I think all of the stories that people came out with kept bringing us back to the present, but drawing on those past experiences.
I think that's true, and I mean, I think there's a conception, the kind of popular conception of history, which would be that it's a line, that it's a kind of linear thing, that history is before, we're kind of now, and the future's kind of somewhere over there. And what Ghost Labs and what these kind of interactions always give us is a sense that actually that's much more compacted, that actually the past lives alongside the present in ways that oftentimes are quite difficult, are quite kind of, contested, but the past, the present, and then actually what we want for the future are oftentimes much of the same existence, aren't they? It's not like the past is over there, we never think about it, the present is here, the future's over there somewhere. It's a very kind of compacted thing where the three coexist together, I think.
Yeah. What I liked today as well was the fact that it moved from very individual, personal, reflective, those moments of silence where people could have a think about themselves, how we were able to move from that very individualistic story to connecting that actually with many different types of communities. So the story of the ferry, which is about a family moving from Ireland to the UK, that then stimulating the idea of those other immigrants, the experience of the immigrants today, and also being moved by those stories. So not just thinking about yourself, but really, you know, the Ghost Lab experience moves from the individual to the collective, which I think is fantastic and very important, you know.
I mean, I think so too. I think it's interesting, you know, with my literary head on, that idea of the ferry is such an interesting one, because this idea that the ferry wasn't just this crossing from Ireland to England kind of 60 years ago, 70 years ago, whenever it was, that actually it's this continuous journey. So you end up thinking of almost the ferry journey down the River Styx and this kind of purgatorial place of being stuck between the past and the present, where you can't quite re-inhabit the past because you can't, because it's gone, but you can't quite inhabit the present properly because the past is still haunting you. And so you end up in this kind of double place, this or no place, this kind of purgatory on this ferry, on this kind of journey down this, you know, almost down the River Styx or something like that, in this kind of really odd way that I found really interesting.
Yeah, I think in that way, the Ghost Lab kind of becomes a sort of a liminal space, doesn't it? And some of those metaphors, like the blank cards, those empty spaces that anything can happen in. The work that we do with the objects, taking objects and putting them into different contexts so that the original meaning of the object is transformed. And placed somewhere else to have a new meaning. So that's shifting through constantly, not being fixed in one particular place or time, but that very fluid way that the Ghost Lab allows people in quite a spontaneous way to shift from a real kind of personal memory from the deep past to suddenly being in the present or thinking about the future. And I think that's what's so powerful about it. It allows that freedom of thought.
I think what the techniques that we've developed kind of collectively over the kind of life of the projects that we've been doing, that we've come to call Ghost Labs, that they allow people to reclaim narratives. I think that the idea that, you know, when we first started off, I remember the first one we ever did in Barnsley in the NUM, and I ran it like I'd run a writing workshop for anyone, for kind of poets, for the writers, in that I said, right, write this as though you're that, or imagine this and let's write something about that. And so I still kind of had the control of that, whereas actually now using blank cards, we've used postcards in some of the groups, blank postcards, to give people just an empty space which they can fill with their narratives. The onus is much more on them, that it's a system, it's a kind of space in which the participant and not the facilitator is in control, where the participant and not the facilitator decides the direction of it, decides what we're going to do that day, decides what mood or what tone it's going to have. And so for me, that's the main difference between kind of facilitating something like this as a Ghost Lab and kind of how I would run a writing workshop for amateur writers. It's the abandonment of ego on the part of the facilitator to pass it over to the participants and to the ghosts, in some ways, to decide where it's going to go.
Yeah, I remember one of the early conversations with Jeff about kind of the idea of social haunting and the Ghost Labs. And it was a really big kind of part of that first meeting. We were asked to bring some objects with us. And I brought an empty frame. And I think Jeff still has that empty frame. And it was the idea of the presence of absence. So that the whole of the social haunting and the Ghost Labs things was that actually we as facilitators became quite absent, and the space was filled by the stories that people bring into those spaces and which emerge. And it's unlike different forms of research, where researchers, the academics, may be trying to extract particular answers to particular questions. What's lovely about the Ghost Lab experience is that, as Andrew was saying, that ego-driven process is suspended. It's about creating the right atmosphere and environment. It's about acknowledging that actually there's a real equity in the room. So it's not us being somehow in control and directing. It's about the we, whoever's in the room, is an equal an important part of what's going on. And, you know, no doubt you will have seen from the Ghost Lab that there was a very easy toing and froing of ideas. It wasn't dominated by any one particular voice.
I think we come with a lot of baggage. We come as figures of, you know, from a university, as a poet, as, you know, someone who's going to lead something. You come with a lot of baggage. You're a figure of authority, as someone in charge, and those are kind of figures and those are kind of words that have really negative connotations in areas like this because of what they lived through, because of what people in charge have done to places like this, because of what figures of authority have done to places like this, to places like Barnsley, to the northeast in the past. And so on one level, just to get by, there has to be a stepping back and an abandonment of something, a giving over of control. But also I do think that part of what I think areas like this are battling with on a kind of macro level, on a bigger level, is narratives that are imposed upon them by other people, for better or for worse. Even kind of, you know, very kind of liberal-minded lefty people will impose narratives on places like this, that they're down at heel, that they're struggling, that, you know, they've got a history of violence, that they're kind of not great places to live. And actually, places like this have had enough of narratives being imposed upon them. They want to write their own narratives. And so our job in a place like this is to offer people the chance to control their own narrative, to be able to control the narrative of their own life, and through that try to come up with a language to express how it is they want to move forward. And that isn't possible if I run it like a writing workshop. That isn't possible if it's run kind of dictatorially or if it's run very kind of firmly. There has to be a looseness in that because we don't know what these people's narratives are. We don't know what they want to say. We don't know what they want in the future. We just have to open a space that asks almost implicitly those kind of questions and allows them that space to then think about those ideas. And we can't answer those questions in 2 hours. We just can't, but we can begin that conversation.
Yeah, a lot of the language that came out of today really supports what you just said, Andrew, because there was a thing about not being heard, people pretending to listen but not really hearing, things that are being swept under the carpet in some ways that are still present, and not being able to move forward until some of those things are actually spoken about and acknowledged. And it wasn't all negative either. There was a real sense of people knowing who they are, and being determined not to have that taken away from them. So not being defined by them not having coal mines anymore or them not having, I don't know, kind of purposeful jobs. But actually there's some deep sense of we know who we are. And through us knowing who we are, we can also connect with other people who are experiencing that kind of oppression, the hijacking of their stories for different purposes. And there was nothing resolved today. So even though we were kind of setting all right, so what next? If you could say something to whoever it is that needs to hear it, what would it be? It wasn't a fixed answer. And I don't think Ghost Labs don't look to tie things up in a very neat and tidy, satisfactory fashion. It's allowing then those open ends to look where might they branch out to next, what might happen next. And the people that have been here today are going back into real communities. The stuff that that has emerged from them today, they won't just kind of stick somewhere else. They'll take it out, they'll think about it. It may prompt them to have conversations which they may not have had otherwise. So I like the idea that the things that happen inside this defined time and space does have some kind of effect, an ongoing consequence, which we'll never see. You know, we're not going to go follow people around and see what happens next, but is to have faith in the fact that by coming together through sharing stories, the potential for them to go out and share stories and listen may be kind of excited somehow. and people being in a room together that wouldn't necessarily meet up. So, you know, Diane came from another project, her being able, again, to make those connections with people, even though she's not from the area. Actually, there's a really strong connection, wasn't there, through her own childhood experiences as well.
I noticed that you both became facilitators but active participants in the session. Is that something that, like Andrew, you were saying, that sort of evolved over the period of running them up a lot? Is that something, that kind of sharing in the kind of participating, telling your own stories, kind of being part of the group as well as facilitating, is that something that's evolved or something you've always done?
It's something that I've kind of always tried to do in my practice, but I think it's really important. I think working with any group, you have to walk in with the least smart, least kind of together, least important person in the room, otherwise it just doesn't work. And so you have to make fun of yourself, or you have to make yourself vulnerable. If that's what you're asking other people to do, you have to kind of be the most diminished person in the room just to be able to run anything like this, and yet still have that authority to be able to run it. And I think that's often quite a difficult thing. I do think, though, that, you know, communities like this, or kind of any community that struggle, are sick to death of people coming in and asking them these questions. Are sick to death of kind of well-meaning projects. Are sick to death of people, as we were saying before, kind of coming in, extracting knowledge and taking it away back into an academy, and it having no real benefit to them in their real life. And I do think that part of, you know, us telling our stories of where we're from, or kind of our family connection to the mines, or to mining, or to kind of austerity, I think that's really important, because it says, actually, we know where you're coming from. We're part of this narrative too, and we might have kind of gone about it a different way. We might be exploring it in different ways to, you know, we might not be on the coalface, as it were, of the community, but we're trying to do through academia a lot of this kind of work. But I think telling those personal stories, saying, my granddad was in that pit, I'm glad you remember Grimethorpe and things like that, or Great Alton Main, I think those things are really vital to put us on a level with the participants, or to kind of at least be asked, to ask permission to be part of their world for a little bit, I think is important.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that. It's funny, one of the cards that came out was equality, wasn't it? And I think that there has to be that real balance. Nobody's pretending, because like at the beginning of that question, why are you here? Oh, Sue phoned us, Sue phoned us. It's like the pressure there. But actually, that's really about a gathering, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then becoming, like you're saying, the least important person in that space then. So that you're not the dominating voice or ambition. Because I don't know about you, Andrew, but although we have the opportunity to run Ghost Labs, I don't have any fixed picture of what might emerge as a consequence. So it's, you know, I don't have any fixed questions or a direction.
But you have to be alive. You have to turn up with every possibility in the back of your head, don't you? I thought today that we were going to do writing based on music. I'd brought like soundscapes. That's why I was sat on the table with a bowl for a long time that turned out to be inconsequential, because I was going to put my phone in a bowl and kind of play soundscapes out to people of kind of industrial settings and get us almost to meditate backwards using sound. I would say to some of the Ghost Labs that we are trying to create a space which allows people to articulate their past, maybe in a way that they haven't before, to talk about the specifics of their memories of the past in a way they might not have before, in the hope that that can give us a new language, a new linguistic framework to move forward in a different way, to help these communities move on in a way that means that we carry the past with us, because we don't want to forget it, but actually that it's not a weight around us anymore, that we can wear it a different way. And I think the Ghost Labs, as a gentle exercise, as a kind of space exercise almost, are a way of helping us get that language to move forward.
For me, the Ghost Lab kind of can be summed up with a phrase that a Holocaust survivor said to me, and he said, what is not acknowledged can never be healed. And I think that for the communities we're working with through the Ghost Labs, quite often they're being told, forget the past, get over it. You know, just like the the gear that was used in the coal mines has been left underground and buried, and there's those nice undulating green things that are in the place where coal mines were. The Ghost Lab actually legitimises those experiences. It brings them back in a very authentic way, which isn't romanticised, which isn't kind of put in some industrial museum somewhere for everybody to go at. But is reclaimed and owned in a way then that allows people to think about what are we going to take forward with us and what are we going to leave behind. And I think that's very powerful. Andrew mentioned gentrification before. Things are always being improved, but actually what a Ghost Lab does, it engages with the people who really need to be part of what that improvement could be and should be.
I think that's a really important point. I know that the only wanted a kind of a short lift pitch from us, Steve, but we were talking before about this idea of class, about this idea of the working class and middle class, and certainly this idea that when I was growing up under Blairism, everyone was meant to want to be middle class. That was like the aspiration. We all should want to be middle class. And there's nothing wrong necessarily with aspiration, but what that did was make the working class identity incredibly transient in a kind of wider culture. And so it said to a country, to a society, it said, so you're working class and you're either stuck there because you failed, or you're going to be middle class. And they're the really only two options. And so what happened was that working class identity got really hollowed out, and it lost its own narratives, it lost its own ability to tell its stories, because it felt like it had failed to be middle class, and then had become stuck. And actually what spaces like this do, like what Sue was saying, is to actually validate the working class identity, validate the working class stories in all their different kind of permutations, and actually say, no, where we are now, we can be proud of. The people that we are now, our accents, our voices, our songs, are worthy of being proud of. We don't have to want to aspire to necessarily be anything else, that word better, whatever that might mean, because there are narratives, there are stories, and there is a culture in the working class that needs space to be celebrated.
Right, thank you.
Cool.
So you see, like putting the phone in the bowl.
Go on, I want to hear that now.
That was a filmmaker's technique to loosen you all up.
Thank you, Steve, it worked.
Take the piss.
I mean, it might have just completely destroyed Andrew, but you know, it worked for me, thank you.
She's sandwiched now.